I invite you to turn to Daniel chapter 2 this evening. Daniel chapter 2. This is our fifth week in the series entitled Counterfeit Gods. It was inspired by a book I read last year by a Presbyterian pastor named Timothy Keller. I'm not re-preaching his content. He gave me several seed thoughts. So if you hear a really good thought, I probably don't get the credit for it. I just want to make that disclaimer so I don't risk plagiarizing anything. But I have digged into these texts that he has highlighted, and it's opened my eyes to some things, not only in the Word, but on my own mind and heart. And I pray it would do the same in your life as well. I'm already prayed, so I want to really just get into this text here in a moment, but collect our thoughts in the meantime. So Russian dissident Alexei Navalny stood before a camera a week ago, perfectly healthy. It was addressing some legal matters, and he was spending some time in a penal colony in Russia because he had opposed their leader, Vladimir Putin. And as he went back to his normal routine in the penal colony, out of the blue, it was announced on Friday that he went out for a little walk and just, for some reason, collapsed and dropped dead. Now, if you know anything about Russia and how they do things in a dictatorship, anybody who is a dissident or who is a threat to the regime is taken out. On top of that, Navalny was poisoned about 2 years ago with a very severe nerve agent, and he kicked it and survived somehow. And yet, the regime was just biding their time. And suddenly, he collapsed with no advance notice, and he's no more. Now, it doesn't take a historian, it doesn't take someone with a brilliant IQ to figure out what 2 + 2 equals in this scenario. And when we learn about Navalny and what has happened to him, we're reminded of what a dictator does, not only when he's powerful, but when he's fearful. And what we see when somebody is taking out their rivals is not someone who is just power hungry. Well, they might be that, but also someone who is constantly driven by jealousy and fear of being overrun and overtaken. Now I realize you're thinking what I thought. I'm not taking people out. I'm not that power hungry. I'm not that insecure. But I think there are two symptoms that can surface to show that we hold on to our control a little bit too much. Number one, anger. When our plan does not happen, and we're not talking about watching out for someone else, like my plan, my agenda, what I want. When that doesn't happen and we get angry, that ought to at least be a check to evaluate a little bit more and say, why am I angry? Because more times than not, it can be a control situation. Or that miserable emotion, jealousy, just feeling like something that you have is being threatened. Like, I got my control right here, but this is being threatened. And of course, the jealousy mode can kick in. And we're ready to put somebody in their place. Now, there's times to be jealous. I mean, men, it's okay to be jealous if there's another lover pursuing your wife. I would say it's healthy to be jealous at that point and do something about it. There's a time and a place for that. But many times our jealousy is not founded on a godly impulse. And again, that points to the idea of maybe we're leaning a little too much on our control. Now, we're going to see a man named Nebuchadnezzar who he pursued the counterfeit god of control. Now follow with me in Daniel chapter 2, just the first 3 verses to begin with. And we'll eventually tell the whole story of chapter 2, the whole story of chapter 4 to make a couple of valid points. Look at what it says in chapter 2, verse 1. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. So this evening, let's look at this counterfeit God of control. Now in chapter 2, there's a clear lesson. And in chapter 4, there's a clear lesson. And that's really going to form our 2 points this evening as we look at this text. And we're not going to be able to go verse by verse. If you want more of a verse by verse rendition, go back to our YouTube channel 2022. We preached a whole series in the book of Daniel. And what some of the symbolism is, we unpackage and unfold it together. I'm not going to get into that this evening. That's back in 2022 if you want to check that out for yourself. But this evening, what I want to look at this evening is the theme we see in this King Nebuchadnezzar. Notice, first of all, that God taught the king about his weakness. God taught the king about his weakness. First lesson. Now, what happens to show his weakness? Well, the king was very insecure and very weak in 2 ways in chapter 2. Number 1, as I just read in verse 1, he couldn't sleep. It says he was troubled and his sleep brake from him. How does it feel to not have the power to sleep? Have you been there before? It's pretty miserable. Whether it's physical pain, whether it's anxiety, whether it's fear, whether it's something that you're trying to figure out on your mind, whether it's some kind of emotional struggle that you're going through. It's no fun being sleepless. It exposes our weakness. I don't even have the strength to sleep, the power to sleep right now. That's where Nebuchadnezzar was in verse 1 and 2. But then this dream comes upon him. It doesn't specify what the dream is at this point. And once he receives this dream, now it's really bothering him. What is the interpretation? And this is the second way he's showing his weakness. Not only can he sleep, but secondly, he does not know the interpretation for this dream. And from there's this crazy searching to find out who could tell me not only the dream, but the interpretation. Now, he calls his magicians before him, his wise men, his counselors, and they come before him and says, hey, tell me the dream and the interpretation thereof, and then you'll be promoted to great esteem, great position in my kingdom. But if you don't, I'm going to get rid of all of you. Wow, there's no middle ground on this one. Talk about extremes. If you want to advance, you can. Or if you want to refuse, you're going to be executed. By the way, these magicians' lives would never be the same again, wouldn't you say? Their life would be permanently altered based on this king's ultimatum that he lays down upon them. Now, they come before him and they say, O king, please tell us the interpretation, and based on the interpretation, based on the dream, then we'll tell you the interpretation. The king says, I know you all. You're just biding time. And you're going to make up some interpretation. So you come up with the dream. You tell me what I dreamed last night. Then I know it's legitimate with your interpretation. Well, in verses 10 through 13, they make a statement that is revealing. If you pick up with me in verse 10 to begin with, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Now, the magicians, advisors, if you will, are spot on. There's no man who can do this. This is something that only God can do. By implication, they're already pointing at this is going to require something supernatural, something beyond the realm that any human being can do. And of course, in verses 11 through 13, the decree goes forth to execute the magicians because they're not going to follow through on giving the dream or the interpretation. Now, I can just imagine in verse 13 and verse 14, they're going through. Daniel is one of the advisors. He's only 2 years into his stay in Babylon, according to verse 1. He's still a very young man, maybe 18, 19 years old. But as all these advisors, all these magicians, as the word is here in our Bible, as they're rounded up, somebody knocks on Daniel's door too and pulls him out of bed. I mean, this could be the wee hours of the morning. And what's going on, Daniel's saying? The king has summoned all of you counselors, because since nobody can interpret the dream, all of you will be executed. Daniel, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, says, hold on for a minute. Hold on. And notice what he says in verse 14. He answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. And so he is updating Daniel on everything. Daniel is trying to understand what's going on. And then he gets with his fellow Hebrews in verses 17 and 18. They prayed to the God of heaven that they would not perish with the rest of them. Long story short, Daniel appears before the king and says, hey, blessed be the king. There is a God in heaven who can interpret this dream. He's summoned before the king. And Daniel goes through and tells the king his dream. Now, many of you are familiar with this story. I'm just going to do a crash course of what this dream is. There's a massive statue that has a very strong head all the way down to the feet. It gets more and more inferior in its material to its only feet of clay. And there's a massive stone made without hands and comes through and just demolishes the whole image. Now, it's interesting that as he is telling this dream, I wonder if it occurred to Nebuchadnezzar that this huge image had all these materials, and the least valuable commodity in the whole dream was the stone that wiped everything out. You ever thought about that? This is the most powerful commodity, is the least expensive, and it demolishes the gold, demolishes the silver, demolishes the brass, the clay, everything, and it's just a stone. That's a point in of itself. What is weak, what is invaluable, ends up being the strongest in this story. Well, Daniel steps forth and he offers the interpretation. And he says that those 4 different parts of the statue are 4 different kingdoms. You're at the head, O king, and then there's going to be another one that's inferior to you, another one inferior to you, and another one yet inferior to you. And there's going to be a kingdom that comes that will wipe out all these kingdoms and establish itself upon the earth. Of course, that's referring to the millennial reign of Jesus. And we look forward to that day, don't we? The king didn't fully understand all that at this point. But the point was that he was being told, hey, you are not in control. A stone, the least costly item in this whole dream, that has more control than you as the gold head, O king. Now notice Nebuchadnezzar's response, and I love this, beginning in verse 46. So we're going to jump down quite a ways. I told you the story basically of all that happens, the major highlights and details. We come to verse 46, and notice how the king responds once he understands the interpretation. The king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshiped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth, it is that your God is a God of gods, the Lord of lords, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. Now, do you understand what he is doing at this point? The world power of this day, probably plus the most arrogant man of that day, extols the God of heaven and says, there is no God like your God. No one like him whatsoever. And here he is humbling himself, bringing worship to Daniel's God for the interpretation of this dream. As I look at this world power basically being prostrated before his creator, I'm reminded that God is the one who's in control, not any world power. And by the way, we ought to take great comfort in that the worldly elite, whether it's in Washington, D.C., whether it's overseas, whether it's connected to the United Nations, at the end of the day, they are not in control. Our God is. But sometimes we get in our own minds that I'm in control of my world. I'm in control of my destination and what goes on in my life. A 19th century poet and writer and critic named W.E. Henley suffered tuberculosis growing up. Through that and some other health struggles, he had a leg amputated. But it was ingrained in him to be tough and to be in control and forge his own destiny. To the point as an adult, and once he had gained quite a bit of his success, he penned these words. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. He was determined. He was known for that by all of his friends and even some of his enemies and critics for being a man who controlled his own destiny. He would conquer. He would overcome. But he and his wife Anna, after a few years of marriage, gave birth to a little girl they named Margaret. She was their pride and joy. And at age 5, through some serious health struggles, Margaret passed away. Henley didn't know how to handle that. And throughout the rest of his life, he never fully recovered from the loss of his 5-year-old daughter. He came to realize there's something out of my control. Now, I realize that we might not be a gifted poet tonight like W.E. Henley. But Jesus, speaking through Paul to one of the most carnal churches in the New Testament, the church at Corinth, wrote this in the first letter, 1 Corinthians 4:7. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory, as if thou hadst not received it? In other words, we have much less power than we think, even in our own lives. Now let's reason this out for a moment. Keller points this out, and I never had heard it put this way. Now I realize we are free agents. We can choose whatever we want. No one makes you do anything. I'm a big believer in that. We are not victims. But let's be honest for a moment. When it comes to the 3 factors that form us where we are, we have our genes, we have our context in which we live, in which we were given, and then we have our choices. Now let me work that out specifically. We have our genetic makeup, our personality, our gifts, our talents. We have the situation into which we were born, our parents, our location, our city, our country, and then we have the freedom to choose. Let me put it in a negative way. If you're born in the streets of Calcutta, it doesn't matter how hard you try, you're never going to be the CEO of a company in America, no matter what you decide. And so you have these 3 different factors. You realize 66% of that, if you go by all 3, that's all God. That's all something He's given us. It's humbling to realize that where we are ultimately goes back to what God gave us. Now I realize that some of us are self-made people. We've overcome a lot. I think of our church. We've overcome a lot over the last 20 years, and I'm thankful for that. I mean, we started very humble beginnings back in the early 2000s, and where God has brought us has been amazing. And we can say, well, it's personal fortitude and tenacity. But let's be honest with ourselves. If you have achieved some level of financial stability, you got to ask the question, who gave you that knowledge? Are you the source of that knowledge? Or did somebody instill it in you? And then, along with that knowledge was some level of drive to get there, especially if you weren't handed much. And so, who gave you that inner drive? Like maybe that's part of your temperament, your personality. Is that something that began with you, or was that given? I think we know the questions, the answers to these rhetorical questions. When it comes to something like climbing up the ladder in your workplace or your career and making a name for yourself or developing quite a reputation, hey, what a blessing. But keep in mind, that's a gift from God, because who gave you that desire? Who put that desire in your heart? Is that something that was self-mustered? And who gave you that capacity to be able to handle that? and all that goes into being able to, sustain the stress and maybe some of the anxiety that goes with that position and the capacity to keep everything straight. The point is this: much of what we get to enjoy has been given to us. We are merely stewards at the end of the day to use our freedom to choose to steward what has already been given to us. The point is this: we are not the source of what we have. God is, which tells us something. We are not, at the end of the day, in control of our lives. Ask someone who has had ideal health, hardly ever going to the doctor, and yet a little microscopic bug invades their body and cripples them the rest of their life. Ask someone who has been just clicking along financially, has no financial mistakes, and is financially secure, and then a huge curveball comes their way out of their control through a huge lawsuit that was out of their control until it wrecks their financial future. It happens. These things are out of our control no matter how hard we try, or no matter how much we might advance, and our freedom to choose and how much we leverage our choices. There are still so many factors out of our control. And God was teaching the king this lesson about his weakness. Now, you would think he would have learned it. I would hope we would learn it. But King Nebuchadnezzar didn't learn the lesson. In the next chapter, what is he doing? He's building a statue that's 90 feet tall and commanding everybody to bow down to this statue. Whoever doesn't gets thrown into the fiery furnace. You know the story. But I'm going to fast forward to the next story because he still didn't get it. And in chapter 4, after being exposed to the God of Daniel twice, once through the interpretation of a dream, another one through their survival through the fiery furnace, that's chapter 3, we come to chapter 4, and it's as if the first lesson in chapter 2 was merely academic. Like he didn't hurt through this. It might have been a little humbling, but it didn't affect him physically or mentally. It was all academic. But in chapter 4, God is going to move beyond the academic and use some physical discipline upon Nebuchadnezzar. Which brings me to the second point tonight. God disciplined the king over his pride. God disciplined the king over his pride. Let me put it bluntly. In this story, the king lost his mind. Now, look at what it says in verse 4. Now, this is Nebuchadnezzar writing, which is very interesting. You have a pagan king writing first person about what happened to him. And notice what it says. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Okay, so those of you who study the Bible, you're like, what's the main point of this passage? Verse 3, that's it. That's where he's going. That's where he's going to end when this chapter's all done. But he goes on quite the adventure to make this point. What happens in this adventure? Well, you can read about it in verses 4 through 7. He has a dream, and it troubles him. The dream is that there's this huge tree that's giving shade over the earth, and the birds of the air are finding their homes and their nests in this tree. And then yet someone comes down from heaven and cuts down that tree and just has the stump there, and the rain comes up on it. And for 7 seasons, the scriptures say. And then he wakes up, and he's bothered by this dream. He did not have anybody who could make this interpretation known. So in verse 8, we find that Daniel at last came before him. And of course, his name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of Nebuchadnezzar's God. And he beseeches him, hey, Belshazzar, will you please show me the interpretation of this dream? And he goes through and says, this is what you dreamed. This is what it means. That tree, O king, is you. And you're going to be mowed down. You're going to be cut down. 7 seasons are going to pass over you. You become animal-like. And then he turns from interpretation to preaching and says, O king, leave off your injustices. Take care of the widows and the poor. Execute equity among your kingdom. And make sure you're humble before your God. The king might have heeded that for a while. A whole year passes. And then he comes up on the balcony of his palace. I can just imagine him looking, seeing those hanging gardens, which Babylon was known for. The world's largest swimming pool. All the gold, all the jewels, all the wealth that he's accumulated by conquering other kingdoms. And he strokes his chest and he just says, look what I have done. Look at my majesty. And that very hour, his own servants came and drove him from the palace because they sensed he was losing his mind. He went crazy. And for 7 seasons, which is most likely 7 years, he went out into the wild and ate grass like an ox. He had his fingernails grow out as if they were like talons. And his hair became matted worse than any hippie out there. And it looked like the feathers of a bird. And here he was like a beast. And no one wanted to get close to Nebuchadnezzar. And 7 seasons passed over him until we come to verse 34. Notice what happens. A turning point occurs when he finally humbles himself and acknowledges himself before the God who created him. Look at what it says in verse 34. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? You see him worshiping God. He's humbling himself and acknowledging that God, here it is, you are in control, I'm not. Why is he finally getting it? Because he's been disciplined. It's not academic. You can't educate people into righteousness. There has to be some kind of deeper lesson that happens for someone to get it many times. And that's what's going on with Nebuchadnezzar. He has felt the power of God, and he's felt his own weakness, and he finally states his lesson in verse 37. Look at the last verse of the chapter. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Wow, what a lesson. He had to pay for this lesson up front. My point is this. We believe that we're in control, usually because of our own pride and ego. Myself included, we all have it. And God uses a sense of no control in our lives to humble us and get us looking up to him. So we'll praise the one who is in control. Do you like the Chronicles of Narnia? C.S. Lewis? You remember The Voyage of the Dawn Treader? Particularly, do you remember Eustace Scrubb? He had a little attitude in that novel, to the point where they came upon a dragon's stash. And C.S. Lewis wrote to describe his response to the stash. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. You see, when we think we're in control of our own destiny, we can become a predator very easily. And that's exactly where Eustace was headed. And he woke up from this sleep a dragon. Of course, his friends are just horrified. A dragon. And he's looking around. He's horrified. He goes around. He tries to fly a little bit. And there's nothing he can do to change himself. Nothing. Until he meets a lion named Aslan, the main character in the Chronicles of Narnia. And as a picture of Jesus, that's what Aslan pictured, he had this boy, now dragon, lay down, prostrate on his back, and Aslan takes his claws and rips him open and shreds the skin and gets right to his heart. And it's painful, it's excruciating, but once he's done, guess who comes back? It's no longer a dragon, but a boy. Eustace has been resurrected through his discipline and humility. And that's exactly what goes on with Nebuchadnezzar here. He had to be disciplined and humbled. And humility resurrected the real man from the inside. There was new life that came because of that humility that he had finally found. Now, I realize that when it comes to something extreme as Eustace or something as extreme as Nebuchadnezzar, hey, we're not that bad. But let me just lay out what we tend to think sometimes and what we should think sometimes. For example, when you fail, it's easy just to beat yourself up, roll down in the mud, so to speak, and just wallow, get depressed. But keep something in mind. Were you in 100% control of that failure? Or did God allow that to happen? To teach you something? And if we wallow in self-pity, we beat ourselves up, and we can't get out of that failure, we're being a control freak. Different way of looking at it, but we're being a control freak. We think that we're the only ones who are in control. We're the ones who have failed. Hold on. There's someone behind that lesson, that failure. He's your Father who's trying to teach you something. Therefore, the way we relinquish control when we go through that failure and we tend to wallow and beat ourselves up, rather than beating ourselves up, we respond by acknowledging, I made a mistake. I was wrong. But not stopping there. Having the courage to look in the mirror before God and say, God, you're in control. You're teaching me something. Help me to get it this time. And you're relinquishing the control. You're relinquishing your ego. And what is happening? God, like Aslan, is cutting you open to your heart and saying, let me expose what's in your heart so I can make a new you. Now, we don't like talking about failure, so let's talk about success. When things go your way, you get a break, or you work hard and you finally accomplish what you're set out to do. It's easy to bask in it. People acknowledge, people applaud. And we feel like Elvis Presley. Thank you very much. No, but that's not the right response when we do that. Rather, we need to respond by thanking God for being the source of my success. Thank God for giving me the drive. Thank God for giving me the ability. By the way, it's not humility to deny that you have a gift. That's not humility to deny that. Humility is just acknowledging where your gift came from, God Himself. And so acknowledge that God is the one who gave you the gift, and then refrain from comparing yourself to people that don't have that gift. They don't have that same opportunity that you have. Because if you do, we get bolstered up in pride, don't we? At least I'm not like that person. At least I've gone better than that person over there. Hold on. They got a different set of gifts. They got different circumstances. We can't compare ourselves to one another. We got to just look to our God and say, God, thank you for the way that you have granted me the drive, the strength, the gifts to pursue the success. All the praise goes to you because you're the source of any success that I enjoy. So what's the point of this? When you let go, if you could show that this evening, when you let go of the God of control, you find security in God's control. Make sense? So when you realize that you are not the master of your destiny, that there's someone larger than you that is controlling this ship, that is equipping you and helping you and gracing you and strengthening you, that's when you ultimately find security. Because if you're hanging out in the first half of this, you're going to be insecure, you're going to be jealous, you're going to struggle with anxiety, thinking that you're the one who has to be in control of everything. God did not wire you to handle that. But when you come to the point where we acknowledge that He's the one who's in control, and I can rest in His plan, I can find security in Him, I'm telling you, what a relief that is. That I can rest in Him. I can look to Him for His goodness. I can look to Him for His way. I can trust His way. And boy, that gives us peace of mind. And we can go so much further with that mindset. Now, to conclude our time this evening, turn over to Philippians chapter 2. Because the ultimate example of someone who relinquished control and submitted to the Father was none other than Jesus. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, Paul writing from prison to these Philippian believers. When you have it, just say amen. I want you to be able to see it. Do you have it? Amen. Okay, we're on the same page. So verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So in other words, have this attitude, have this mindset that was modeled by Jesus. What is this mindset that Jesus had? Look at what it says in verse 6. Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Now, you stop right there. He lost control. He relinquished so many of those heavenly privileges. I'm not saying that he gave up his deity. We don't believe that this evening. But all those privileges and comforts he was enjoying in heaven, he surrendered. He let go and confined himself to an infant's body, and then went lower than that by dying a horrific death on a cross. Why? Because he was willing to trust his Father. He surrendered to his Father's mission. And then what happened? It wasn't that it made his demise. He found ultimate security and rest. Look at what it says in verse 9. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him and given him a name above, which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Hey, brothers and sisters, be encouraged tonight. You are not the master of your destination. You say, that's discouraging. No, it's liberating. Because someone else is who can control it. That you can rest in and worship and adore and just say, you are the one who's in control. I can give all the praise and glory to you for what you've done for me. And so let's be some followers of Jesus tonight that leave this place and we are trusting and resting in our God who is in control.